Welcome to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner, and I'm here with you today to do our sixth and final installment on evangelicalism, what happened. And in this final segment, part 6, we're going to go into where do we grow from here? Where do we grow from here? As I told everyone from the outset that I am speaking from the position of an insider. I identify with being an evangelical, not so much in the political sense as has been blown out of proportion that we've seen through a certain alignment with a particular party. But in the true sense of being an evangelical, you are simply saying, I am a Christ follower. And so, from an insider, I'm speaking from the standpoint that there are things that I've seen amongst those people that identify with this particular faith path that's been problematic. Some of it has been beneficial. Some of it has been enlightening. So my hope that through the time that we've spent together in these last 6 weeks is to begin to update our understanding on what does it really mean to be an evangelical and just what actually happened to this particular faith practice. And so this is what we have basically been dealing with. But I want to start out with a quote by Tony Campolo. Those issues are biblical issues. To care for the sick, to feed the hungry, to stand up for the oppressed. I contend that if the evangelical community become more biblical, everything would change. Everything would change. So, where do we grow from here? So, in a brief recap of evangelical history, during this series, I endeavored to bring the best voices, past, present, regarding the beliefs, history, practices, and challenges of evangelicalism. Some of those voices were fundamental to the formation of evangelicalism, such as Martin Luther, whose founding of the Protestant Reformation gave birth to evangelicalism. Two other key figures associated with America's first Great Awakening were Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. It was during this time the concept of the new birth emerged and took hold on evangelicalism. There were other renowned public figures like Charles Finney, a notable preacher during the second Great Awakening of the early 19th century, that made the revivalist evangelicalism a staple of American culture. Others included D.L. Moody in the late 19th century, Billy Sunday, Aimee Semple McPherson in the early 20th century. Then in the second half of the 20th century came Billy Graham and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whom we learned about their affinity that they had toward each other in our last segment. And we also learned about their contribution to evangelicalism. Well, not only did we look at public figures, not only did we look at some important individuals in the formation of evangelicalism, but we also looked at some subject matter experts. And there are expert scholars on the subject of evangelicals and evangelicalism whose material I referenced throughout this series. Namely, here are some of the books that I listed throughout the series. Jesus and Justice, Evangelicals, Race, and the American Politics by Peter Heltzel, Evangelical Theology, A Biblical and Systematic Introduction by Michael F. Bird. American Evangelicals, A Contemporary History of Mainstream Religious of a Mainstream Religious Movement by Barry Hinkins. Progressive Evangelicals in Pursuit of Social Justice by Brantley W. Gassaway. The New Evangelical Social Engagement by Brian Steensland and Philip Goff. And we also picked a book from Baker Academic called Advocating Justice, an Evangelical Vision for Transforming Systems and Structures. So I shared all this to let you know, that we stand on the shoulders not only of our ancestors who have been echoes and voices about, the faith that we practice, but we also stand on the shoulder of scholars who are experts in this field, who have done their research, who have done their homework, and are presenting the facts. And so what I've tried to do is to present these facts, allow you to make your own decision as to what evangelicalism really is. And so one of the first things that I think that we can do to grow from here towards a renewed evangelicalism is that let me bring this point. I think this is huge. We learn how the present state of affairs with the evangelical community harbors some of the same concerns that the white evangelicals faced during that period. And the period that I'm talking about the period, the antebellum period, the period around when slavery was still going on. And one of those things that was learned that white evangelicals had to come to grips with is this. And how do we remain witnesses for Christ in the world while dealing with the ugly problem of slavery and racism in America? That's what they experienced then, and that's what we see that the evangelical community is faced with today. I am convinced that if the evangelical community is going to untarnish their witness and be the people that God destined them to be, we can sticking our head in the sand is no longer an option. How? How have we stuck our head in the sand? How have evangelicals stuck their heads in the sand? By remaining silent about the age-old problem of racism in America. We have to become a force of both black and white evangelicals who, through the Spirit of God, find some way to heal. By dealing with the problem of race first in its own camp, and second, be a beacon of light for the rest of America. Secondly, the evangelical community must unhitch itself from the burden of right-wing politics as being the appropriate Christian response to American society. Evangelicalism at its core is greater than a handful of syncretized special interests and projects such as abortion and same-sex marriage that have been purported by the Christian right and the conservative right as being the things that God is concerned for when validating a public servant. I'm here to tell you that there are far greater issues at hand that matter to God than just the life of the unborn, but also the injustice of those born in a world without privilege or marginalized and mistreated because of the color of their skin. Thirdly, if the evangelical community is going to redeem itself, they must display unfeigned love towards all humanity and not be found as hypocrites favoring American ideals of prosperity and privilege at the expense of those Americans that Jesus classified as the least of these. We can't say we love God and we don't love our neighbor. We have to have some sort of empathy and connection with those that society has labeled the least of these. And we have loads of examples throughout the scriptures, whether it's the Good Samaritan or others, where we find that there were people that went beyond the status quo, went beyond the cultural norm, went beyond the even the political climate to do something towards those that are called the least of these. We find that Jesus, hey, he did not stay within the confines of the status quo. For he stood there in Luke 4:18, and he stood there quoting from Isaiah. It said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because I'm anointed to do what? Preach the gospel to the poor, preach deliverance to the captives, recover the sight to the blind, set at liberty them that are bruised." And so he was very interested. He was very enthusiastic, and he was very passionate about the least of these. Furthermore, if the evangelical community in America is going to bring its light from under the bushel basket of compromise, then the evangelical community must repent and return to the teachings of Jesus and righteousness and justice that were established in the Hebrew scriptures. Well, in my opinion, it's time for the evangelicals in America in particular, it's time to be reborn. It's time to revisit what the definition of an evangelical is and try to expand that into something that's more relevant, something that's more powerful, something that's more inclusive, and not just geared toward, a certain set of morality, but does not gear toward all of humanity. The word evangelical, the noun itself, it means in a group of Christians within Protestant Christianity who emphasize the authority of the Bible, personal conversion, the atoning work of Christ on the cross, and actively involved in the world through preaching and other forms of missionary activity. Now that's the redacted version. A true evangelical is a Christ follower that endeavors daily to be an incarnational witness. What did Paul say? That you are living epistles, known and read of all men. Or what did Jesus say about himself? That he was the Word made flesh. So we, on the one hand, are incarnational by being living epistles, by being words in the flesh that witness for the Christ, by living a life that best resembles the Christ in our present time. Now that could be, is, and furthermore, actively proclaims the gospel of the kingdom that Jesus preached in hopes that all of humanity might be redeemed and reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. So there is the preaching. There is that evangelistic preaching that goes forth. Along with their evangelistic efforts that we find in Matthew 28, 19 and 20, they practice the kind of social justice that resembles efforts of Christ to relieve the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized of society. It is this component of social justice that has been in many ways divorced or estranged from contemporary evangelicalism that we see being purported in our community today. Now, there are people that are making some strides to try to bring it back, but I'm identifying it is the component of social justice that's missing. And by overlooking or leaving out social justice, guess what? The least of these get overlooked. The marginalized get overlooked. And so therefore it keeps people of the status quo in place, and those who are on the bottom rung of the social ladder or even the social economic ladder gets overlooked, or their issues and matters that get drowned out by something greater or something more dominant. And so, as evangelicals, we can't be a true evangelical if we're not preaching the gospel and if we're not engaging in acts of justice. So, that brings, since I want to talk about in this last portion here about what I feel that can bring about some redemption, can bring about some help, that can bring about a revival or awakening for evangelicalism here in America. So we need to revive some basic evangelical practices, and we know what they are. We've talked about the 4 and 5 components of the Bebbington's quadrilateral and the fivefold essentials that that evangelical sets on. But I am suggesting, and I'm strongly suggesting, especially in light of our current climate, especially in light of what we just witnessed through this election, that one of the things that has come to forbear, one of the things that's come up is such a division, even in, and a disdain for evangelicalism. A division in our society and a disdain for evangelicalism. And anytime that someone says they're an evangelical, they automatically associate it with that divisive, racist, and lack of empathy representation of that particular Christian group. Now, I know all evangelicals are not racist, but as I said early on, you don't have to be a racist to embody racist type of thinking and encourage racist type of dialogue. When we see people out there on the street that are protesting because of Black Lives Matter, many evangelicals resist that, and they'll change the narrative and they'll say all lives matter. Why not listen to where they really hurt and ask the question, how can I help? So, in my opinion, evangelicals must conclude that social justice is not the social gospel. For contemporary evangelicals today, which have been influenced by the Christian right, and we've seen a lot of this in the research that I've put out there, so this is just not me talking out the side of my neck. I'm standing on the shoulder of scholars that have already pointed these things out. For contemporary evangelicals today who have been influenced by the Christian right and those evangelicals and fundamentalists of the 19th century, guess what? Both seem to struggle with the concept of social justice as being biblical. Oftentimes, it has been misunderstood to be the social gospel, which was a teaching that sought to change society with Christian dogma without Christian conversion. In other words, trying to change the society with a group of Christian principles, but not have the salvation experience that the gospel talks about or that Jesus preached about. However, true evangelicals practice evangelism along with acts of justice. We see this in the book of Acts, that while at one time that on the day of Pentecost, we find that at the preaching of Peter and that event, over 3,000 folks got saved. The church began to grow. But as the church began to grow, we also that the issues began to show. When the church began to grow, issues began to show, and we see that there was existing in their midst a tension that had to do with ethnicity and an ethnic history that exists between two groups of people who are now Christians. True evangelicals practice evangelicalism along with acts of justice, social justice. And just like the practice of social justice became especially problematic during the period of the abolitionists and the civil rights movement, it is still a problem for evangelicals today. In fact, whenever you mention the word evangelical, the problem of race seems to resurface. So we need to get a renewed sense of evangelism and social justice as being part and parcel, and find out why there's such pushback on social justice. Some of it has to do with its tie to abolitionist period and its ties to the civil rights period. That if I'm an advocate for social justice, then I am against the status quo. I'm against what's really going on here in American society in the name of religion. So let me tell you why I'm so passionate about this. Let me say this. In 2008, I became disillusioned with the response of evangelicals towards social justice, when the scriptures clearly teach that this concept is part and parcel of Judeo-Christian teaching. So what I did, I researched the Association of Evangelicals, that's a national group around the National Association of Evangelicals, and I found that in their evangelical manifesto, social justice is very much included in the context that I'm talking about here. My question is, well, why haven't all those who are evangelicals embraced the teachings of their own faith or with the tradition that they have an affinity toward? So early in this series, I mentioned that the average evangelical Christian doesn't know why they believe what they believe. We have simply accepted what is popular and become emotional about it without ever asking, why do I believe what I believe? I learned evangelicals compared with Catholics do not have a consensus around social justice or how social justice should be carried out by their congregations. For evangelicals, I learned that they have been persuaded far more by a political, secular opinion about social justice than the Holy Scriptures. This inspired me to pursue a doctorate in this field, to do one or two things, either validate or disprove my findings. So I chose to go the secular route because they provided a more robust array of theoretical models to examine my problem statement. And my problem statement was primarily based upon some of the things that I found out. That among the evangelicals that I had done the research around and began to do research on, it was commonly noted, even in scholarly writing, that many of these evangelicals did not learn anything about social justice when they went to seminary. And so therefore they came out of seminary unprepared, or that part of that's important was left out. And so therefore they have a sanitized version of what it really means to be fully evangelical. You can't be fully evangelical without engaging in acts of justice and righteousness as affects other people. So my problem statement was clear that there was a lack of training. And so how then can we get prepared to lead people who need us if I don't think they matter? I don't think their life matters the way I think that unborn life matters. or I politicize their position with my Christian belief system. And so it's a problem. So I pursued a doctorate in this area, and I come to learn these things, that the transformational leadership theory was a good theory to use because it has already been used in examining pastoral leadership. Pastoral leadership is important when it comes to education, spiritual formation, and activism of the local congregation. So what I did, I reached out to over 30 different pastors, black and white and brown, who identified as evangelicals, who have or had social justice activities operating through their congregation. 18 of them confirmed an interview, and I gave each of them key questions about what leadership skills are required for social justice engagement. And this is what I learned. And I'm only sharing this because I think this is one of the ways that evangelicals here in America can untarnish their witness, can redeem their image, can get back on track for what's right for the kingdom of God and what's right for the people of God and what's right for those whom the people of God are in the midst of, which is America. So I believe that one of the ways that we can make a difference through leadership is getting some training on social justice. So those evangelical pastors that are intending to engage in social justice activities, they should consider the following. Become familiar with the Evangelical Manifesto and with scriptures both in the Old and New Testament that address social justice. So if you identify as an evangelical, go look up the Evangelical Manifesto, become familiar with it, and become familiar with scriptures in both the Old and New Testament regarding social justice. Secondly, familiarize yourself with individuals that have contributed to the theological shaping of social justice engagement, anywhere from Reinhold Niebuhr to Walter Rauschenbusch to Martin Luther King. Thirdly, how can you make a difference? Identify the social ills in your own community that if you want to address, you have to inquire with other pastors that are addressing those concerns. Being able to understand what shapes the minds and groups of individuals who are not only the benefactors of privilege, but also who are marginalized and excluded because of social justice issues. That's important. Next, you have to be a bridge builder. Those who are compelled to lead social justice efforts in this community should be a bridge builder, not just allies, not just with the allies and constituents, but with those individuals that don't agree with you. It takes a unifying spirit to be a bridge builder. Next, you got to have vision. Visionary is an exceptional quality according to the transformational leadership theory. Evangelical pastors do not have to reside in complex or challenging parts of the community in order to have an evangelical vision that mirrors redemption and the kingdom of God for all and not for some. You have to have the ability to see what others can't see. Passion and communication skills. Being passionate about something or about a cause is oftentimes reflected in displaying compassion towards people. I remember that in reading the gospel, we find that Jesus was moved with compassion on the multitude and he healed them. I think at the precipice of healing a multitude is the influence and the intent of compassion with just the one. And if we as a collective have compassion, we can heal a multitude. So being passionate about a cause is oftentimes reflected in displaying compassion towards all people. Communication skills is not only the ability to articulate your vision and inspire people, but it is the ability to listen to people and be able to hear all sides. Sometimes the issues are not always cut and dried. They are not always black and white. When we lack in this ability, we will forfeit fairness in dealing with others or advocating for their cause. Well, this has been this series on evangelicalism, what happened. We've covered 6 episodes to give us an historical array. We've covered various aspects and those different ones that have contributed. And in this last segment, I gave you my spiel on what I think we need. That if we identify with the evangelical traditions, we have got to adopt social justice to be a part of the package. And if I don't know how to do, I can talk to those who in my own community that have, who can be a mentor, who can give some advice, who can give some training. God bless you. We will see you here real soon on Talking Points next time.